Who mugged 58-year-old Arthur Simmons on November the 4th last year? Simmons, who was physically unhurt but shocked, claims his attackers were black. Directly after the attack and the theft of his wallet containing £2, Mr. Simmons was helped along to a policeman, Constable Kershaw, by Mrs. Winifred Palmer, who saw the men come out of the alley where the mugging took place. He and Mrs. Palmer went with Officer Kershaw to a local youth club run for the young black population in the area. There, both Simmons and Mrs. Palmer picked out Colin Langham and John Dempsey as the assailants. They both deny the charge. Langham's defence counsel has just brought up the fact that Mrs. Palmer was already furiously angry at the time of her identification. Angry at some black children who, a day before Guy Fawkes night, had been throwing fireworks around the building where Mrs. Palmer lived. Defence counsel ended his cross-examination by claiming the identification made by Mrs. Palmer must therefore be treated with caution. The court has just started to hear the evidence of Constable Kershaw, the officer on duty that night.
As a result of information given to you by Mrs. Palmer and Mr. Simmons, you took them to the Kingston Beach Youth Club.
Yes, sir. You see, I have what they might call a thorough knowledge of that area. It's not the first mugging I have encountered. And I have found out that any crime involving the colour fraternity in that part of Fulchester would be known about at the Kingston Beach Youth Club on the High Street.
Any crime, Constable?
Beg pardon, sir. Any crime involving a young person of the fraternity.
And what did you do then?
I requested permission from the youth club leader to interview the members on the premises.
Did you get it?
Yes, sir.
Go on, please.
Well, in the main hall there were about 50 young men and women, boys and girls I should say. I asked for their assistance, explained I was looking for 2 young men, and requested their permission for Mr. Simmons and Mrs. Palmer to look at all the boys present, sir.
And did you get their permission?
Yes, sir.
Readily?
Although I say it myself, sir, I've worked with the colour fraternity for many years. I think they've come to trust me as a fair man over those years, sir.
And describe what then took place.
I asked the young ladies to leave the hall for a short time, and they did so. The young men remained and lined up along one wall. I then asked Mr. Simmons to accompany me along their ranks, and if he recognised any of the people that had robbed him, he was to reach out and touch them.
And did he?
He looked at each one carefully, sir. We'd passed 15 before we came to the accused, Langham. Mr. Simmons stopped, reached out, touched him on the shoulder. He said, "That is one of them, officer." We then proceeded up the line about another 5 or 6 places further on. He stopped and identified Dempsey in a similar manner, sir.
And where was Mrs. Palmer at this time?
She was just following behind, sir.
Did she verify Mr. Simmons' selection of Langham and Dempsey?
Yes, sir, most definitely so.
Did Mrs. Palmer make the identification of either defendant before Mr. Simmons?
Well, there was some hesitation over Dempsey, sir.
In what way?
Well, Mr. Simmons definitely stopped in front of Dempsey. He looked at him hard and it was, however, Mrs. Palmer who actually turned round and spoke first. She said, "That's the other one, that's him." I knew it was, Mr. Simmons replied.
I see. Then what did you do then, Constable?
I asked Dempsey and Langham to accompany me into a small private room adjoining the main hall, sir. There I asked them what they were doing between 8:30 and 9:10 that evening.
What were their replies?
Langham said, "What are you trying to do us for, you pig?" Dempsey said, "I have the right to call a solicitor if you intend to charge us." I repeated my question, stating I was merely interested to hear where they were.
And what did they reply this time?
Dempsey said, "With my girlfriend on the way here." Langham said, "Why do you always pick on me, Kershaw?" Well, on the strength of the identification made by the 2 witnesses, Mr. Simmons and Mrs. Palmer, I took them down to the station. They were cautioned and charged with robbery, sir.
Did they make any statement after being charged?
Yes, sir. Dempsey said, "You live to regret this, Kershaw. I want to ring my solicitor." Langham said, "This is victimisation. You always said you'd fix me one day."
Thank you, officer.
I'm representing Mr. Dempsey, officer.
Yes, sir.
How long have you worked in this part of Fulchester?
8 years, sir.
And during all that time, has it been predominantly a coloured neighbourhood?
Pretty well, but more so in the last few years, sir.
8 years is a long time to have had one particular beat, isn't it?
Quite long. But it does happen in any division, sir.
You didn't mind not being moved?
On the contrary, I enjoy working there.
You get on with immigrants?
Yes.
They trusted you, you said?
I'm happy to think so, yes, sir.
The coloured fraternity?
Yes, sir.
Constable, I don't wish to quibble with everything you say, but when you refer to them thus, could you possibly mean the coloured community? Isn't that much the more usual term?
Well, maybe it is, sir, but I've always said coloured fraternity.
You see, why I bring it up is that in my experience, policemen usually refer to wrongdoers as the criminal fraternity. Sociologists usually say community when they're speaking of racial groups within society, and I wondered if, possibly unconsciously, you got the two phrases a little bit jumbled.
No, I don't think so, sir.
Have you ever used the word spade or sambo directly to the faces of some of the people resident in the area you patrol?
No, sir.
My client maintains that you have.
He is mistaken, sir.
Constable Kershaw, I'm not going to pretend that there is no tension between the police and the immigrant population of Fulchester, nor, I think, are you.
There's always some tension, sir. I mean, some troublemaker wants to stir it up in any area, black or white.
But if we're to believe your story of your entry to the Kingston Beach Youth Club on November the 4th and the cooperation you received in answer to your various polite requests, everything is rosy between you and the immigrants of Fulchester.
Well, not exactly rosy, sir, but there is cooperation.
With the Kingston Beach Youth Club in particular?
Yes, sir.
Despite the fact that you and several other members of your division raided the club 6 times during the last 2 years?
Not raided, sir.
Well, I don't know what else you'd call it. In May 1971, a search for drugs was carried out, 5 arrests. In April of 1972, a search for dangerous weapons, no arrests.
The club has its share of troublemakers, sir.
There was a riot there in June of last year when you tried to line everybody up for one of your periodic drug searches, wasn't there?
There was a minor disturbance caused by a handful of wrong-uns, sir, not a riot.
Is it not the case, Constable Kershaw, that when you went to the club on November the 4th, you obtained the so-called cooperation of the club by threatening to close them down forthwith, quoting all kinds of intimidating regulations such as fire risk, redevelopment planning, and downright plain harassment if they did not allow you in to look for the 2 muggers?
It is not the case, sir.
I wonder. What does black power mean to you, Constable?
Can mean trouble, sir.
Do you not see it in every afro hairstyle? In every black man wearing a dashiki or a woolly cap or pattern moccasins? In every manifestation, in fact, of a group of people who insist on retaining their own customs, their own mode of dress, their own culture?
Lord, the court has been most patient with my learned friend. Hopefully he will curtail this philosophical discussion with himself. But, my lord, there is no evidence to say that this officer has not carried out his unenviable duties to the letter.
Lord, in cross-examining this witness about the identity parade in which my client was detained, I find large gaps in credibility. I am questioning the circumstances in which this identity parade was held.
You weren't doing that, Mr. Fry. Rather, you were interrogating the officer on much more abstract matters, or so it seemed to me at least.
If I might crave your lordship's indulgence for a few moments longer, I'm trying to understand the relationship this officer says he has with the immigrants of Fulchester, with whom he claims to be on friendly terms.
Yes, well then do so as briefly as you can. We are sitting on a case of robbery, you know. We're not commissioned sitting on community relations.
I'm most obliged to your lordship. Constable Kershaw, do you or do you not have a short list of places you go to whenever a crime is committed on your beat in order to learn the names of those responsible?
Yes, sir.
Is
Every policeman has one, or should have.
Yes. Is the Kingston Beach Youth Club one of those places?
Yes, sir.
In view of this fact, do you still maintain that you get the full cooperation of the club whenever you go there looking for criminals?
The members realise it's only a few tearaways that cause all the trouble. They want the police to get rid of them.
Do you or do you not have a short list of people you interview whenever a crime is committed in your particular area?
Yes, sir. Again, it's common police practice.
Is John Dempsey on that list?
No, sir.
No, he is not. But as you well know, Constable Kershaw, Mr. Dempsey has never been in trouble with the police in his life.
That's correct, sir.
Now, your admission that the club was on a short list explains why you made straight away for the club when you learned of the attack on Mr. Simmons. And there you somehow secured this curious identification parade in which Mr. Langham was identified first by Mr. Simmons and then by Mrs. Palmer.
Yes, sir.
But when you got to Dempsey, it was Mrs. Palmer who spoke first.
Yes, sir.
But surely, Constable, you should have separated your 2 eyewitnesses. You should, in order to maintain police regulations, you should not have allowed Mrs. Palmer to see Mr. Simmons pick out the first suspect.
On reflection, yes, sir, but there was a lot going on at the time.
Well, not according to you, there wasn't. You say that everybody was being most cooperative. However, we won't tread that path again. On reflection, it would have been better to have split up your 2 eyewitnesses. You admit that.
However, both Simmons and Mrs. Palmer immediately and positively picked out Langham, sir. There's no question about that, and I think you'll find the youth club leader will bear that out.
When Mr. Simmons approached Mr. Dempsey, did you point at him and say, "Here is our revolutionary, he hates all white people, he's your man"?
I did not, sir.
I have evidence to the contrary, Constable.
My lord, I know this is rather irregular, but may I say something?
In view of the roasting that counsel has just handed out to you, I think you may have a minute, so long as what you say is relevant to the case.
Thank you, sir. My lord, members of the jury, I've been a policeman on the beat for 20 years. 8 of those years I've spent on duty in the immigrant area of Fulchester. Now, I'm not a saint. I'm not gifted with the patience of Job. I lose my temper like the next man. I know that to some people I'm a symbol of authority that they hate. Whenever anything goes wrong, even when someone complains about some government decision, I'm the one who has to suffer. It's always a lonely policeman on the dark street at night. He's the one who has to carry the can back. He's the one who always gets it in the neck. Yes, I've been angry with black people, but I've always tried to be fair. I'll defend the innocent, but I will arrest the guilty. Sometimes I've been wrong, but I've never tried to be wrong. I've always tried to be honest. On a patch like mine, you can't always go by the rule book. Sometimes you've got to compromise. You've got to turn a blind eye here to get something bigger elsewhere. You've got to employ the language of the street. And that's not the language your mother taught you. But despite what's being said here today, I do not hate black people. I like them. I believe in God, and I obey his laws, to trust everyone equal on their merits. I've always believed that, and I hope I always shall. Thank you, my lord.